in things other than Skyrim? I guess George R.R. Martin must have been a fan of the game to get the inspiration for his novels, because now there's even an entire TV show dedicated to the dragons, and a little bit to their riders. So I thought it would be cool to create a mod pack to reflect the world of Ice and Fire as best as I can. As always, the load order is in the description, along with a Nexus link, and there are timestamps so that you can skip to the parts you need. Honestly, my favourite thing about House of the Dragon are the dragons themselves. I never really cared for the designs of Daenerys' dragons. Because they were brothers, they were just different coloured versions of the same design, so they sort of blended together until the end of the show when they became the large one, the undead one, and the other one. But in House of the Dragon, the design for each of the different dragons is so unique, and it does a lot to reflect their strengths and weaknesses, and they even have some elements that showcase the personalities of their riders. Put simply, if I show you a picture of Vaghar, Caraxese, or Syrax, you can very easily tell them apart, and even without knowledge of the show, you can probably tell me a little bit about them. So with all that in mind, I really wanted to overhaul the dragons to give them textures to match the show, and to try and make them feel as mechanically different to one another as possible. The first mod we have is Game of Thrones House of the Dragon Vanilla Dragons, which is going to overhaul the looks of the 8 dragon designs in the base game, as well as the House of the Dragon Skeleton Edit, which is going to make the dragons larger and increase their wingspans to make them look more imposing and dangerous. And then we'll have a host of other mods, which are going to retexture specific dragons to look even more like their show counterparts. I'm going to go through the selection I went for, but these mods can be mixed and matched to suit your preferences. First of all, we have the regular dragons, which are going to be replaced with Arrax. These are the weakest variant of dragons, so it makes sense that they're replaced with a relatively small dragon, with Luke Velaryon being the least confident rider. Then we have the blood dragons, which are going to be replaced by Moondancer, who's ridden by Baelor Targaryen. Moondancer isn't the most powerful dragon, and isn't much larger than Arrax, but is incredibly fast, making her more dangerous than you'd think. I think the design being used is actually a green variant of Caraxese, but it looks like Moondancer as well. Next we have the Frost Dragon, which is going to be retextured to look like the undead version of Viserion. Since the blue fire they breathe is the closest thing Westeros dragons have to breathing ice, it fits the look well. We're also going to be using these textures to replace Durneviir, the dragon found in the Solkarn. There are a lot of difficult names in this bit. Then for the Elder Dragon, we're also going to be using Viserion, but this time it's the living version, with bronze scales. It's definitely Viserion being used here, but the colours are a bit more vibrant and golden, so from a distance it also kinda looks like it could be Sunfire. Now we have the Ancient Dragon, which is going to be replaced with Syrax, and I think this is my favourite of the set. Syrax has incredibly distinct horns and a unique face, and these textures have captured that perfectly. Syrax is ridden by Rhaenyra in House of the Dragon, and is relatively powerful, but we also have a collection of the 3 most powerful dragons, used during Aegon's conquest of Westeros. The first and strongest of which is Balerion the Black Dread, who we will be using as a replacer for Alduin. Balerion was ridden by Aegon the Conqueror during his conquest, and later briefly by King Viserys. He is the dragon whose fire was used to melt the swords that were forged into the Iron Throne, and he's credited with the destruction of Harrenhal during the war. He is also one of the few dragons in Westeros to live long enough to die of old age, meaning by the end of his life he was pretty much as big and powerful as a dragon can get. So I think this is the perfect choice to retexture the World Eater. Balerion doesn't appear in either Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, so the design is based on the descriptions from the book. But we can see his skull here below the Red Keep to show how large he was. To go with this, we have Paarthunax, who's going to be retextured to look like Vaghar, who's ridden by Visenya in The Conquest, and later in House of the Dragon, she's ridden by Laena Velaryon and Aemond Targaryen. Vaghar is the largest living dragon at the time of House of the Dragon, and the textures do a good job of capturing her unique appearance. Then for the legendary dragons, we have Meraxese, who was ridden by Rhaenys during the Conquest. Another large dragon that we've yet to see in any TV shows, so again this design is based on the book descriptions and artwork. The revered dragons added by the Dawnguard DLC are going to be replaced with Vermax, who's ridden by Jace Velaryon in House of the Dragon. Another relatively small dragon, but with a very cool look. And the Serpentine dragons added by Dragonborn are going to be replaced by a more blue variant of the Caraxese texture, which I think looks a lot like Sea Smoke, ridden by Laenor in House of the Dragon. And our final vanilla dragon replacement is Odahviing, who we can replace with either Meylese, seen ridden by Rhaenys in House of the Dragon, or Caraxese, seen ridden by Daemon. If you're using the full mod pack, then you're going to want to select Meylese for this, because we're going to be adding Caraxese as a different dragon later on. Now, there are a handful of other mods that improve the dragons in some way, or add on new ones, starting with Wormtooth, which is a full quest and land expansion, adding an entire new island with its own campaign, lots of new locations, and NPCs. I've mentioned this one in a previous video, and it's very fitting for a more dragon-centric playthrough like this one. It adds in a new dragon called Vulcrakar, who we will be replacing with textures for Dreamfire, seen in House of the Dragon ridden by Helena, and also here scaring Aemond. Then we have the Diverse Dragons collection, which adds a whole bunch of new dragon variants to the game. All of them have unique visual designs and new mechanics to make each encounter feel that bit more dynamic. Normally I would suggest using the full mod, but here we're only going to be using a few of them, as only some are covered by the Westeros textures that we're using. The 4 dragons in question are the Dark Dragon, which will be replaced by Drogon, who's ridden by Daenerys in Game of Thrones. The Earth Dragon, who will be replaced by Raeghal, who's ridden by Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. The Sanguine Dragon can be replaced by Viserion, but we're going to be overwriting that with textures for Caraxese, since we already have both of Viserion's textures in this collection. And finally, the Combustion Dragon, which is going to be replaced by Syrax. One smaller mod, which is going to add some more dragons around Skyrim, is Dragon Protected Cities, which adds a friendly dragon to each city. It stands watch over the city, and then should bandits or cultists attack, they're going to spring into action and defend it. My final dragon mod is Scales Like Broadswords House of the Dragon Edition, which is a collection of mods that overhauls dragons to make them a bit more interesting, now giving them random Westeros-style names, improving their attack animations, and increasing the frequency of their spawning based on how many of them you've killed. I also have an honourable mention with the monstrous Game of Thrones dragons mods, which would replace Alduin and Paarthunax with Drogon and Raeghal instead. We already have mods adding them into the Diverse Dragons collection, but if you're just looking to change the vanilla dragons to the ones from Game of Thrones, this is an option for you to use. Next, we're going to be moving on to player gear. I'm going to go over the mods I've added here first. Most of the major houses and factions are covered, but the ones that aren't, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to create those looks, or as close as possible, using different modded and vanilla gear. The first thing we have is Game of Thrones Armours for Skyrim Special Edition, which is a large collection featuring a whole bunch of armour sets, as well as some weapons. There are a few pairs of gloves and boots that unfortunately are missing their textures, but the vast majority of stuff added by this mod works fine, and it looks great. For starters, we get 3 sets of Lannister military gear with a jerkin, a standard cuirass, and an officer's cuirass, complete with pauldrons, as well as the distinct helmets to go with them. Then we have the Stark sets. There's the standard set and the captain's armour, which is the sort of thing we saw Ned wearing in Season 1. And then there's the Winterfell set, which is the military version with pauldrons added. which is more along the lines of what we saw Robb wearing throughout a lot of the War of the Five Kings. Next we have the Barathian gear, starting with the Cuirass of Storm's End, which is the general military gear seen worn by Stannis' army throughout the war. There is also a set for Stannis himself, and a set for Renly Baratheon to go with it. Unfortunately, Robert Baratheon's armour and his iconic helmet are not included, but you can create a similar look using an Ancient Nord helmet and the Storm's End armour. There are also a handful of armour pieces added specifically for individual characters or smaller factions, such as the Night's Watch, which gets a jerkin and a recruiter variant which matches the clothing worn by Yorick in the show. There's the Iron Island armour, seen worn by Theon and Yara quite frequently. There's the Kingsguard armour, complete with a white cloak. It's the Game of Thrones version of the armour, featuring the crown engraving on the chest piece. Then there's the Tarth cuirass, which is what we see Brienne wearing throughout the show. And the Knight of Flowers cuirass, seen worn by Loras Tyrell. The exiled Northern cuirass is the knight's armour seen worn by Jorah Mormont, and we have the armour sets of both Clegane brothers, with the mountains coming with his large full-face helm. Finally, there's the Sellsword's jerkin worn by Bronn, and the Traveller's tunic which is worn by Arya in the later seasons. So there's a ton of armour added, but also a couple of weapons. Longclaw used by Jon Snow, Oathkeeper used by Brienne of Tarth, and Ice used by Ned Stark, and more recently Cregan Stark. There's also some non-Valeryian steel blades, the Mountain's Greatsword, and a Dothraki Arrax for you to use. And to go with all this armour, we're going to be using Winter is Coming, which adds in a bunch of cloaks and capes for you to use throughout the game. The fur cloaks in particular look perfect for the Night's Watch look if that's what you're going for, or there's a variety of capes that match pretty much any knight's gear. Now, as you could probably have guessed, because this is a set for Game of Thrones instead of House of the Dragon, it's missing Targaryen armour. So to replicate that, we're going to be using the dragon-carved armour sets. There are 4 in total, and they look great. My personal favourite is the blood-etched variant, which has these carved runes all over it. The Winter and Raeghal sets also look really cool. They are very extreme and really stand out from the environment when you wear them. And the base set is probably the closest thing to Daemon's dragon armour that we're going to get in Skyrim at the moment. The mods can be installed as a collection, but they all have the same stats, so you may as well just pick one to bring, since you're probably only going to end up using one per playthrough anyway. To go with this, we have the Targaryen armour, which adds in the set of armour we see Arthur Dayne use at the Tower of Joy in Game of Thrones. And then we have the Targaryen King armour, which is Jon Snow's Winterfell gear, but with a Targaryen sigil on the breastplate instead. We also have Shield and Sword of the Dragon, which isn't specifically styled after anything from Westeros, but the shield in particular has a design incredibly similar to the Targaryen house sigil. I also have a mod bringing some additional Stark armors for you to use. The first 2 are already in the collection we added, but these are slightly higher quality versions of Ned's and Robb's armor, and this time Robb's has the metal breastplate. It also adds in a new set, which is Jon Snow's Stark armor, which he is seen wearing from Season 6 onwards. So now you can commemorate everyone's favourite era of the show in style. To go with these armor sets, we have Game of Thrones House Shields, which adds in shields for House Lannister, Stark, and Targaryen, which all look fantastic, as well as an oval variant for the Lannister shield based on the version we see in the show. These shields are fully craftable with the Advanced Armor perk, and I really like them. House sigils on shields are possibly the most instantly identifiable element of Westeros, so seeing them around Skyrim goes a long way. I also have 2 armor sets which aren't based on any particular character or house from the shows, but just sort of fit the Westerosi style quite well. I picked these ones in particular because they kind of match what I imagined Dunk wearing in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. First of all is the Elite Knight armor, which uses textures from Dark Souls and reflects what I pictured Dunk's general travel gear to be similar to, particularly in the Sworn Sword. Then we have the Vigilance of Stendarr Templar armor, which looks more like what I would have pictured being worn in a tourney, like in the Mystery Knight story. As mentioned earlier, some of the famous weapons in the show are added by the Armour Collection, but I've got some mods here which are going to add some of the rest, starting with Blackfyre and Darksister. Blackfyre is the sword used by Aegon the Conqueror, and later by Aegon the Unworthy, and is later used by Daemon Waters in the Blackfyre Rebellion, with House Blackfyre being named after the legendary sword itself. Its design is super rigid, with harsh angles to the crossguard, and a dark iron sort of colouring to the Valeryian Steel. Then we have Darksister, which was originally used and named after Visenya, as she rode Vaghar during the Conquest. Later being seen in House of the Dragon being used by Daemon, and eventually being passed to Brynden Rivers, aka the Blood Raven, during the Blackfyre Rebellion. The sword is thinner than most, and it has more dragon-themed style to it, with a crossguard made to look like wings. Both swords are available in one-handed and two-handed variants, and they can be crafted quite easily. We also have Flaming Sword, which, as you can guess, adds a craftable flaming sword into the game, so you can truly become Azor Ahai as you face off against the undead of the world. The fire can seem a bit over the top, but, well, it's a flaming sword. We also have Dragonglass Weapons, which adds in a new craftable set of weapons using the hilt textures of Dragonbone and the blades of glass, but now coloured to be more see-through. They don't really look like the obsidian dragonglass in the show, but they still fit quite well. Finally, I have two more mods that add in weapons that are Valeryian Steel style, but aren't based on any specific weapons from A Song of Ice and Fire, to give you some original weapons that still fit the Westeros setting. The mods are Terror and Aimer's Edge. I also have an honourable mention called Valeryian Steel Weapons of Ice and Fire, which adds in almost all of the named Valeryian Steel blades from the show. Longclaw, Ice, Oathkeeper, Blackfyre and Darksister I've already covered, but this mod also adds in the Tarly sword Heartsbane used by Sam and later Jorah, as well as Widow's Wail used by Joffrey and later Jaime. These weapons are the most lore-accurate integration that I think is possible. They're incredibly difficult to make, requiring rare ingredients found throughout the world to forge them, which is a nice touch. The main reason I'm not using them is because I prefer the textures being used in the other mods we have, which are based on the show designs instead of purely the book descriptions. Although I don't have any other mods for Heartsbane or Widow's Wail, so if you find yourself needing to defeat a pie in combat, this may be one to bring along. Another honourable mention I thought was worth bringing up is Game of Thrones Overhaul and House of the Dragon Overhaul, which are mod collections that change the names of people and locations in Westeros. They update armour and add some architectural changes, as well as adding some new races to reflect the different people found in Westeros. The main reason I'm not using this one is because they don't cover everything, and the bits they do cover clash with a lot of my other mods. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go through some of the houses and factions that don't have direct mods to try and create looks for them. And the first area we're going to be looking are the Dothraki, for which we're going to use the Redguard Knight armour and the Redguard Assassin armour, which combined with the Dothraki Arrax creates the look perfectly. Then for the Wildlings, you'll find that the Skarl gear looks very similar to the coats worn throughout the show, but if you want to create a more aggressive look similar to the Thenns in Game of Thrones, the truly unique Armour of the Gods and the Helm of Oberyn Bearclaw is what you're going to want to use. Finally, I have some mods that are going to change the looks of some of the game's pre-existing armour to fit the Westeros style a bit more. First of all, we have realistic armour overhaul. And aside from looking Game of Thrones-esque, the armour added by this mod just looks incredible. It covers all of the guard sets: iron, steel, wolf, hide, studded, fur, scaled, leather, stormcloak, imperial, dwarven, and ebony gear. The majority of stuff is given a more Nordic feel to fit with the Skyrim setting of the game, but the dwarven and ebony gear are made a bit more eccentric and look more like the sort of tawny gear you would see worn by champions in a joust in Westeros. Then the imperial gear is made to take even more of a Roman design. The guards are all wearing gear that is much more fitting for a Westeros environment, and in particular the Markarth guard set looks incredibly similar to the armour worn by Dane Hightower in House of the Dragon. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a mod to add his goofy helmet from the joust, but this is still great. I'm going to be replacing the glass gear as well, with molten glass armour and weapons replacer, which makes the gear into this dark red and black scheme, which looks way more fitting for a Targaryen than in the base game. It kind of looks like armour made of fire and blood, which I think you'll agree is pretty fitting for this franchise. An honourable mention I have is Fireglass Armoury, which instead replaces the gear with orange flaming glass. It still looks cool, but I think it's less fitting for this collection. Then we have steel variants of Elven and Daedric armour, which makes them look a bit more on theme. The Daedric armour in particular kind of looks like the Valeryian Steel used in the Conqueror's armour, which is a cool thing to have. I have some follower mods that I also want to go over, starting with Game of Thrones Direwolf followers, which adds in a set of direwolves available for you to take as followers and even ride into battle in true Stark fashion. Then to go with that, we have a selection of companion mods that add characters from Game of Thrones around Skyrim to be used as followers. Some of the characters featured are Grey Worm, Jon Snow, the Hound, Arya Stark, Beric Dondarrion, a White Walker, Tormund Giantsbane, Ygritte, and Gendry. All of them are installed separately, so you can pick and choose the ones you want to use. Now, I have a couple more textures and overhaul mods that will improve the look of the world a little bit, starting with Noble Skyrim, which is going to overhaul the landscape, architecture, and clutter textures to make them look a bit cleaner. Noble Skyrim has a bit more of a classic medieval style to it, so I think it fits the Game of Thrones style I wanted perfectly. Then to add some extra flavour to the settlements, we're going to add a couple of area edit mods, starting with JK's Skyrim All-in-One, which adds more clutter around the settlements and makes the architecture a little bit more interesting. One cool addition is the design of the throne in Windhelm now has some blades behind it, kind of resembling a smaller version of the Iron Throne, if you squint a bit. Then to go with this, we have Cities of the North. We're going to be installing them separately for patch reasons, but these mods are going to overhaul Winterhold, Falkreath, Morphall, and Dawnstar. The new throne added to the Winterhold castle, yes it has a castle now, also kind of looks like the throne in Dragonstone, which is really cool. Then we're going to use Northern Roads to add a little bit more stuff to find along the roads of Skyrim. To go with this, we have Obsidian Weathers and Seasons, which is going to allow for full-scale storms and blizzards throughout the wilderness. Then Ras Shaders and Effects, which allows your clothes to become wet and covered in snow as you travel. Draco's Auras are going to make the skies look nicer, and ELFX will be used to improve the lighting. Finally, we have Divine Creatures and Divine Wolves, which are going to retexture all of the creatures in the game, although we are going to be replacing the dragon textures with those mentioned earlier. Next, we have some quality of life stuff, starting with Valraven Integrated Combat of Skyrim, which is going to make the combat a bit more layered and realistic, by improving NPC behaviour and requiring more stamina for attacks. The reason I'm using this over other combat mods I've mentioned before is because I find this one to be a bit more passive. It improves the realism of the combat without feeling annoying to play. One of my favourite fights in Game of Thrones is the trial by combat between Bronn and Ser Vardis in Season 1. Ser Vardis is fully armoured, but Bronn defeats him by dodging around him until he becomes tired. And that's kind of what I wanted to represent with this mod. The idea that warriors can become tired the more aggressively they engage in combat. For a similar reason, we're going to be using tonics and toxins, which makes potions less overpowered and makes food more interesting. I feel like this pack is best played with the survival mode on, and this mod complements that, because it will make the hardship of travelling a bigger part of the game. Which fits, since the journeys that characters have to make is something that's heavily focused on in Game of Thrones. Well, sometimes. Next, I have a list of mods that I mention a lot in these videos, so I'm just going to go through them quickly. We have a quality world map Vivid, lockpicking interface redone, the Paarthunax dilemma, belt fastened quivers, control, Vera Levi, visible favorited gear, dynamic camera, and pastel map markers. Finally, we have the Game of Thrones music replacer, which is going to replace some of the tracks in the game with the score from Game of Thrones. It lines up the tracks with ones that sound similar so that music from action scenes are played in combat, and more chill music for taverns, stuff like that. I can't play much of it for you because of copyright, but here's a sample. To go with this, we have Game of Thrones main menu music replacer, which puts a piano cover of the main theme over the menu screen. Finally, we have Game of Thrones Drogon main menu replacer, which is going to replace the main menu image with a picture of Drogon and Jon in the snow. And that's the entire pack. This is slightly different to the sort of mod packs I've been making on this channel, so let me know in the comments if you want to see stuff reflecting other franchises like this.